30 years after the end of the American Revolutionary War, the world believed that peace had finally returned. The United States had achieved its independence from Great Britain and was beginning to grow as a young and ambitious nation. Cities expanded, trade flourished, and the dream of liberty lived in the hearts of millions. But beneath that calm surface, tension was quietly building once again. Old wounds had not fully healed. Trade restrictions, territorial ambitions, and unresolved conflicts between Britain and America were creating pressure that would soon explode into a new war. This was not just another battle for land, it was a battle for respect, sovereignty, and survival. This is the story of the War of 1812. The year was 1812, nearly 3 decades after the colonies had gained their freedom. The Revolutionary War had ended, but relations between the United States and Great Britain remained uneasy. At that time, Britain was engaged in a massive European conflict, the Napoleonic Wars, fighting against France. To maintain its dominance at sea, the British Royal Navy began to impress American sailors. That means they captured them from U.S. ships and forced them to serve on British vessels. For the Americans, this was more than a diplomatic issue. It was an attack on national honor and independence. American ships were being stopped, their goods seized, and their sailors enslaved into British service. Across the Atlantic, the situation was growing unbearable. The United States demanded respect and neutrality in trade, but Britain saw America as weak, a nation that could be bullied. The stage for conflict was set. Inside the U.S. Congress, a group of fiery young politicians began calling for war. They were known as the War Hawks. Among them were names that would later shape American politics: Henry Clay from Kentucky and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. They argued that the United States had tolerated enough humiliation. They believed that Britain was not only interfering with American trade, but also arming Native American tribes in the Western Territories to resist U.S. expansion. These war hawks demanded action. They wanted to defend America's honor, protect its economic interests, and perhaps even seize Canada, which was still a British colony. President James Madison, though hesitant at first, finally gave in to growing public and political pressure. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. It was a bold and risky decision. America was still young, with a small army and a limited navy. But for the second time in less than 40 years, Americans were preparing to face the most powerful empire in the world. The early battles of the War of 1812 were anything but glorious for the United States. The U.S. military was unprepared, poorly trained, and lacking in supplies. One of the first campaigns was an invasion of Canada, which Americans believed would be an easy victory. However, they underestimated both the strength and the organization of the British and their indigenous allies. In Detroit, General William Hull surrendered his entire force without even firing a shot, a humiliating defeat. Soon after, at Queenston Heights, American troops were repelled by British forces led by General Isaac Brock, with crucial support from Tecumseh, the brilliant leader of the Shawnee people. Tecumseh's Confederacy was determined to resist American expansion into their lands. For many Native American tribes, the war was not about European politics but about survival. They allied with Britain, believing that a British victory might stop the loss of their territories. These early setbacks damaged American morale. But while the land war was faltering, the fight on the seas told a different story. At the start of the war, the British Navy was the largest in the world. The Americans had only about 20 ships. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in skill, courage, and creativity. In one of the most famous naval battles, the USS Constitution fought the HMS Guerriere. During the fight, British cannonballs seemed to bounce off the Constitution's thick oak hull, earning it the nickname Old Ironsides. The American crew won the battle, shocking the world and boosting U.S. pride. Another victory came under Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry during the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. His famous message to headquarters read, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." These victories proved that the Americans could hold their own against the mighty British Empire, especially at sea. They restored confidence and gave hope to a struggling nation. While naval victories inspired hope, the fight in the Western Territories was brutal. Tecumseh continued to lead his Confederacy in alliance with British forces. However, in October 1813, at the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh was killed. His death marked the collapse of the Native American resistance in that region. The Americans captured Detroit and regained control of much of the Northwest Territory. Though this victory was significant for the United States, it came at a great human cost. The dream of a united Native American front under Tecumseh's leadership was lost forever. By 1814, the war took a dark and devastating turn. After defeating Napoleon in Europe, Britain could now focus its full military power on the United States. British ships blockaded the American coast, strangling trade and causing massive economic hardship. Then came one of the most shocking moments in U.S. history. In August 1814, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the White House, the Capitol building, and several other government structures. Flames lit up the night sky as America's capital burned. President Madison and his wife, Dolly Madison, were forced to flee. Yet even in the chaos, Dolly managed to save a famous portrait of George Washington, which remains one of the most iconic moments of courage from that night. The burning of Washington was meant to crush American morale, but instead, it strengthened the nation's resolve. Following the burning of Washington, British forces turned their attention to Baltimore, Maryland. But there, the Americans were ready. For 25 hours, British ships bombarded Fort McHenry, but the fort held strong. As the sun rose the next morning, the American flag still flew proudly above the fort. Watching this battle from a nearby ship was Francis Scott Key, who was so moved by the sight that he wrote a poem titled The Defense of Fort McHenry. That poem would later become the lyrics of the United States national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. This moment became a symbol of America's endurance and unbreakable spirit. Though peace negotiations had already begun in Europe, fighting continued in North America. In January 1815, British forces launched a massive attack on New Orleans. The defense was led by General Andrew Jackson, a tough and fearless leader. His troops were a mix of regular soldiers, militia, frontiersmen, and even freed African Americans. When the British attacked, Jackson's men were ready. The battle was a stunning victory for the United States. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, while the Americans lost fewer than 100. Ironically, this battle took place after the peace treaty had already been signed, but news of the treaty had not yet reached America. The victory at New Orleans made Andrew Jackson a national hero and gave the American people a sense of pride and unity that would define the country for years to come. On December 24, 1814, representatives from the United States and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. The treaty effectively ended the war and restored relations to the way they were before the conflict. No territory changed hands, and there were no clear victors. But the war had shown something far more important, that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful empires in history and survive. The British, realizing the resilience of the young republic, began to treat America with more respect. The treaty also marked the beginning of a long and peaceful relationship between the two nations. The War of 1812 had devastating consequences. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded. Major cities were burned, and the economy suffered greatly due to the British blockade. Yet from the ashes of destruction rose a new sense of national pride. Americans began to see themselves not just as former colonies, but as an independent and capable nation. For Native Americans, however, the war brought tragedy. With the death of Tecumseh and the collapse of his Confederacy, their resistance to westward expansion was severely weakened. It marked the beginning of a long period of displacement and loss for indigenous peoples. Politically, the war boosted the reputation of leaders like Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, while the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, collapsed soon after. Economically, the blockade forced Americans to develop their own industries, setting the stage for future growth. The War of 1812 is often called America's Forgotten War, but its impact was profound. It confirmed the United States as a sovereign nation, capable of defending its land, people, and honor. It gave birth to national heroes, inspired the Star-Spangled Banner, and united the country under a renewed spirit of patriotism. Though it ended without territorial gain, it marked the true beginning of America's journey as a strong, independent power on the world stage. So, when we remember the fire, the battles, and the bravery of those who fought, we remember that freedom is never won once. It must be defended again and again. This was the War of 1812, the war that proved the young nation's heart was made of iron. And that was the story of the War of 1812, a war of courage, sacrifice, and determination that helped shape the future of the United States. I hope you enjoyed this journey through history as much as I enjoyed telling it. If you learned something new today or felt inspired by this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss the next chapter of history.